We have all sorts of new ways of looking inside the brain while you're thinking, perhaps while you're dreaming. Some scientists have actually been able to create video images. Pretty fuzzy right now, but nonetheless moving in a certain direction with powerful computers, visual video images of what people's thoughts are while they're having them. Can we do mind reading? Can we do mind control? Does that language even make sense anymore? And we have a lot of interest in terms of national security and counterintelligence work in understanding why people are violent, how to manage violence, how to manage political violence in an era in which we're again concerned about terrorism. My name is Jonathan Moreno. I'll be teaching the course on neuroethics. When people ask me, what do I mean by neuroethics? I say, well, you remember those LSD experiments that you might have heard something about in the 50s and 60s that were done by the CIA and the US Army? Do you remember the psychedelic experience that the country had? Recently, Harvard University's class of 1962 had a reunion, and preparing for that reunion, they sent out a questionnaire to all the members of the class, including somebody that most of us know as the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. Kaczynski responded to the questionnaire. What Kaczynski did is not a joke. 3 people were killed and another 23 were maimed by his letter bombs. But what didn't get into the press very much was that Kaczynski himself was in a humiliation experiment in 1959 when he was an undergraduate at Harvard. That humiliation experiment didn't make Ted Kaczynski psychotic, but it's an example of how much interest there was in the academic world in the late 50s and early 60s in the era of what we might think of as pre-neuroscience. We have a vanishing line between therapy for the brain, for brain disorders, and enhancing the brain, making ourselves better, smarter, we think. Many of our young people are on all sorts of medications to help them concentrate better, to make them feel less depressed. A whole generation is going to be on medication for decades. We've never had that experience before. We also have devices that are able, using magnetism and electricity, to change the way we perceive things and experience things. Experiments are being done all over the world with transcranial magnetic stimulation, closed brain experiments. The software that runs our brains is the most sophisticated software there is. But there are people who believe that we can make it better, that we can understand it more deeply. Perhaps we can develop systems that will allow us to download the brain or upload the brain into a non-biological stratum that will actually make us truly members of a thought community, and we'll be able to transfer our ideas to one another instantaneously as we expect more and more technology to be part of the craft of the individual warfighter. What effect will it have on them when we strip those technologies away from them and return them to civilian life? There's a lot of interest these days and concern about the use of drones, particularly drones in the air that are capable of firing a lethal weapon. These drones, of course, are generally controlled by operators thousands of miles away. What people don't think about as much, and raises very interesting ethical and policy questions for the military, is whether you could even better control these drones, not by pushing joysticks and buttons, but through a direct connection between your brain and that robot. And there's already being tested a Sentry robot at the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea that has loaded with technology, loaded with weaponry, and according to news reports, with one switch, could make an autonomous decision to fire without human intervention. There are already defensive autonomous weapons on American ships that make their own decisions of whether to fire or not with human monitoring. Will war even have meaning if it's being fought by automata for one side or the other, against one another? There are some people who think that we are now in the process, on the verge of at least, through neuroscience and also through other complementary fields like genetics and nanotechnology, of creating the next stage of human evolution, rather than being the subjects of the genetic lottery, as we have been for hundreds of thousands of years.